We do have a clause within our terms of service.
I think average users read the terms of service and the updates that are very frequently sent to us.
You know, we are in a societal debate, as we should be, about information practices.
We want people to be able to both review terms of service agreements and privacy policies, and we want them to discuss what they mean, so it creates this type of feedback loop.
When we talk about privacy, is it possible in the 21st century?
You said you agreed when you signed up, so now what? I'm Ethan Smith, and as we'll find out, terms and conditions apply. In episode 4, we discussed potential solutions to the issues surrounding terms and conditions agreements that involve some sort of government intervention. Now, whether or not you agree that such a course is what's best, I think we can all agree that it always takes the United States Congress an extremely long time to accomplish anything. So in the meantime, what other options are there? Are there potentially ways companies could change their business models to improve the state of privacy for individual users? Ethan Zuckerman, whom we heard from in episode 2, proposed one solution.
If you are a heavy user of social networks, and I'm a pretty heavy user of Facebook, I'm a pretty heavy user of Twitter. At this point, you're in this very weird bargain with them. They are going to watch everything you do. They're going to make that available, that information available in aggregate to advertisers who want your attention, and they're going to put ads in front of you. The truth is, I'm not sure I've ever voluntarily clicked on a Facebook ad. I've certainly accidentally clicked on them now and again, but I'm certainly not generating a lot of revenue for Facebook off of ads. Facebook would do better with me personally if they just asked me for $10 a year. And I'd be willing to pay for it because it is actually pretty helpful for me. So the first model that I would sort of suggest in this is, could sites figure out what's their average revenue per user per year from advertising and offer us a tracking and surveillance-free version. So if you assume that Facebook's making $10, $20 a year from us off of targeted advertising, they would be required, in my perfect world, to offer you a $20 to $40 annual subscription. And in paying for the subscription, you would exempt yourself from surveillance. Now, obviously, there's problems with this, right? It suddenly sets up a system in which poor people are under surveillance, people of means are not under surveillance, but at least it gets us towards a place where you could choose platforms that you're using a lot, and you could choose to use them in a way where you're not giving up your personal data as payment for using those platforms.
It's hard to tell whether other privacy-conscious users would also choose to pay a monthly or yearly fee to avoid surveillance, or if they would even trust Facebook to honor such an agreement. However, this model is consistent with other subscription-based business models, which seem to be the way things are going. But that's just it. Facebook and Google probably don't have an interest in changing their primary source of revenue.
I actually think this probably won't come about without government intervention. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Facebook, where you're basically paying for the service, is a linear growth model. The reason that Facebook has the crazy valuations that it does is that investors are pricing in this idea that somehow Facebook, based on all this data it has about us, will be able to revolutionize advertising at some future moment and sell us things at an absolutely unprecedented pace. And as soon as you move into a model where you're essentially saying, well, this is no longer about advertising, this is no longer about selling us stuff, this is really just about a straightforward membership model, it's a boring linear growth business, and the stock price crashes.
To be fair, the stock price probably wouldn't crash immediately, but a switch to a linear growth model would cause investors to become wary of Facebook or Google's future growth. And if you return to Ethan's remark about a paid model excluding lower income users, It might indeed take government intervention to establish whether an individual has certain inherent privacy rights that he or she should never have to pay for. And that is a big question. Right now, it seems that this question has been left up to users and large companies to battle out in the court of public opinion. Chris Katropia, the law professor from the University of Richmond we heard from in episode 3, had some thoughts about how users' willingness to pay can affect the marketplace for privacy.
We do seem to have these moments where society at least appears to care about privacy. So the thought should be that there should be some breakpoints where people would be willing to pay. I'm surprised there's not more competition on this front. I mean, so one area I think that there seems to be at least some competition is in the space for kind of webmail and cloud storage, right? There are some companies out there where I can get cloud storage, not going through Google where they search through all the files that are on there, right? Or Gmail where they're providing right? But those certainly don't seem to be prevalent. And at least I know in the cloud storage space, they're expensive. So maybe those experiments are out there, but they're not as prevalent as you would think, right? Yeah. Given the kind of current climate and concerns.
You'll recall that in episode 3, Chris and Jim Gibson both discussed the ideas surrounding what marketplace signals would need to occur from consumers to cause meaningful change in a company's terms of service offerings. They concluded that in order for anything to change, users have to read the terms. But we've seen that sometimes this doesn't mean all users. In 2012, Facebook announced its acquisition of Instagram for a whopping, at the time, $1 billion. Unsurprisingly, late in 2012, Instagram shared a notice with its users that its data policies were changing to harmonize with Facebook's already established policies. The new terms of service were scheduled to go into effect in January of 2013, but after several users raised the alarm about a controversial addition to the terms, CNET.com ran an article in December 2012 with the byline, quote, "In its first big policy shift since Facebook bought the photo sharing site, Instagram claims the right to sell users' photos without payment or notification. Oh, and there's no way to opt out." End quote. The article's warning prompted concern for many Instagram users across the web and ultimately led to Instagram retracting the change and delaying major changes to its terms. Now, as The Verge also reported around the time of this incident, Instagram's CEO clarified that the company would not be selling users' photos because each user owned their photos. But nevertheless, this incident remains an example of how when someone reads the terms and raises the alarm, it can cause companies to rethink changes to their user agreements. However, as we've seen, it would take countless hours and resources for each user to be able to read and digest the many agreements it takes just to open a web browser or use his mobile phone. So what's the solution? As it turns out, there's an organization which has a sole purpose of making it easier for users to read and understand the nature of user agreements and privacy policies.
The ultimate goal is that we want people to be able to both review terms of service agreements and privacy policies, and we want them to discuss what they mean, so it creates this type of feedback loop where people are building awareness and at the same time educating themselves.
That's Madeline O'Leary, a developer for Terms of Service Didn't Read, or TOSDR, a user rights initiative that seeks to rate and label the terms, agreements, and privacy policies of websites so that users might be better informed about what's actually in each agreement. The project began in 2012, and ever since, the team has attempted to build a database that rates both terms and conditions agreements as well as privacy policies by class, from A to E, with Class A being the best for users and Class E being the worst. At the project's website, tosdr.org, you'll find their browser add-on, which can be used across the internet. Here's how Madeline described a typical use for the service.
Inside of the application, we have the actual terms of service agreement, like the text, and we have the text of the privacy policies, and if it's not there, you can click a button, and we have another tool that goes and scrapes it from the website page. But if the terms of service text is there, all you really have to do is highlight the point that interests you, and that's it. And then a curator will review it at some point, and then it will get approved if all is well, and then it will contribute to the rating on tosdr.org.
Once the curation team has processed each submission, the ratings become available on TOSDR's website, and each rating is presented with a list of contributing factors. For example, TOSDR currently gives Google a Class C rating, citing the company's collection of personal data, ability to read private messages, and tracking users across multiple sites, among other things. However, among the things that contribute negatively towards the rating, the website also displays positive things about each company, if they exist. Some of these for Google include each user's ability to request deletion of data and the fact that Google notifies its users at least a week in advance of pending changes to its terms of service. This rating system, combined with the ability of anyone to contribute to the project, makes it a potentially valuable tool in addressing the problem of user agreements. Madeline sees the tool as an opportunity to create an extremely impactful service.
So it's kind of like a type of Wikipedia. And that's this is what we're trying to get at, is this type of deeply crowdsourced resource for these complex and often deceptive legal agreements that we enter into regularly. So when it was first released in 2012, there wasn't really any type of underlying software, which is what we have now for contributing these reviews. It was just, it was rather informal. So since then, it's been all about scaling the application and making it more stable and easier to use, because there really is a lot of interest. And that's more or less where I came in. And so the project was already existing, but we were like, okay, how do we give this a backbone, like an application backbone that users can really go to and use like they would Wikipedia or something like this.
Having a Wikipedia-like database where users can look for trustworthy information about online privacy practices is a great idea in theory, and the team at TOSDR is well on its way to achieving this. However, if any meaningful change is to happen, it will require large-scale action, or perhaps major changes in habits for everyday users. And this is most definitely easier said than done. Users are responsible for sharing much of the information that is collected online. So what would it take for major changes to happen? Could we, as users, have an impact on the information that is collected by simply changing our habits? For some answers, I sat down with someone who has been studying these questions for many years.
My name is France Bélanger, and I'm a professor in the Pamplin College of Business, and this is my 23rd year at Virginia Tech.
Dr. Bélanger began her research career studying communications, specifically telecommuting via early internet technology. To place this in context, some of her earliest work was with modems that transferred data at speeds 23 times slower than a typical dial-up connection, so she's no stranger to changes in technology. During the rise of the web, she helped companies build websites from scratch with HTML, and thus became more and more aware of both information privacy and security concerns.
Information privacy is about what you decide that you give control to others about your information. Information security is how you protect the information. So, of course, you need to have information security in order to have information privacy. The reason I became more interested in privacy than security is that people make decisions that are not always very logical to me. And it's fascinating, and to this day, I still don't understand people about why they make some of the choices they do. So I've done a lot of research trying to understand that. And of course, lots of various explanations exist, but I still have a very open research question on how do we make people perform better behaviors to protect their information.
Dr. Bélanger has been part of many academic research studies, which seek to observe users' privacy habits, especially in relation to smartphone use. One of her favorite areas of study is the sharing of location data.
So location information on smartphones, for example, is by default turned on for most people. And so, of course, if you're using a map and you want to find your way, you kind of need to have the location turned on. But all these other apps that are asking for your location don't really have to have your location, but they want to do, targeted marketing and all these other things. So we did a study And we looked at actual settings that people had. And we found that I think it was 80% of people had location turned on for apps that didn't need to. So let me tell you about apps that would need. So we talked about maps, weather. I could see why a weather app would need location. But let's talk about apps that do not need location. So, for example, let's say WhatsApp. Why does WhatsApp need to know where you are? There's no reason. Why does a news like CNN or whatever news app you're using, why would they need to know your location? Why would your browser need to know your location except for maps again? And so all of these are turned on. So we had about 86, I think, % of people had all of their apps allowed to use location. Once we showed it to them, most of them wanted to change some of the settings.
From this study, it's clear that when users were made aware of potential privacy concerns in their settings, they expressed a desire to change the settings. However, as Dr. Belanger and her research team found out, it's more difficult to maintain this mindset.
Then we did another experiment. We did the exact same thing. So we looked at their settings, and then we had actually created an app to educate people. It was called the Privacy Helper. And so it was working in a prior version of iOS on Apple. And we gave them the app, and we told them that 1 month later, we'd be doing another survey of both their knowledge and their perceptions. And a month later, not much had changed. So in other words, even though we told them we'd be testing their knowledge about security and privacy on their phones, even though we told them about the issues, people did not change their settings. And so that goes back to my initial conversation of I'm still trying to understand why people don't perform the behaviors that would protect their information.
Now you too may be considering whether or not you've checked your smartphone settings over the past month, and if so, that's great. Awareness is the first step. However, there are other factors that play into whether a user is going to put the time and effort into controlling his or her privacy. Dr. Belanger's research studies have revealed possible causes for why people neglect their privacy when using online or in-app services.
The one factor that comes up in every single one of my studies, and we're talking about Fitbit usage, smartphone usage, home speakers, is benefits. So there is a theory in my field called privacy calculus. People compare the costs and benefits, right? And the cost is usually the risk, or the effort, but usually it's the risks. And the benefit is, what do I get by sharing all this information? And benefits is always the most significant factor in the model in affecting behaviors. So people want the benefit of disclosing information, and they are willing to live with the risks, and also they don't want to make the effort. So we've got multiple factors here. Another one we found in a different study was that people give up. So it's like, I just can't keep up with all this privacy stuff. I just can't keep up with all these settings. And so I'm just going to give up. So we call it learned helplessness. It's been used in the other field, but that's another reason.
Many of us can identify with these reasons, especially since we enjoy the services provided by the apps and websites which we already know to be data collectors. Despite producing a privacy-focused podcast, I am a Facebook user, I make frequent use of Google services, and I have a Twitter account for this show. It would be difficult to completely stop using these services. Difficult, but not impossible. Consider also the implications of choosing to change your habits online. Imagine for a moment that now that you've listened to this podcast, you're concerned about what you're sharing and you're ready to act. Unfortunately, a gigantic barrier looms in front of you in the form of all the terms and conditions agreements and privacy policies of the service you're already using. Remember Jim Gibson's study involving terms and the purchase of a computer? It's likely that if you've been using online services for several years, you wouldn't just have to read terms equal to the length of the first Harry Potter novel. it would likely be closer to reading the entire series. As an example, consider how many agreements I've had to accept during the process of creating this podcast. All of the websites I've obtained information from have had terms and privacy policies. I wrote the script in Microsoft Word, which has a lengthy end-user license agreement. The software I use to record and the music behind the show both have license agreements. And when I release each episode, I use a service which has both a terms and conditions agreement and a privacy policy. It's also likely that you had to accept a few agreements just to listen to this show, especially if you're listening through an app on your smartphone. In fact, take a moment to think about any action you take on the web or on your phone. As we discussed in episode 2, most services are collecting your data for some purpose, whether it's targeted advertising or to make improvements to your experience based on things like your age or your interests. Now, I certainly don't want you to stop listening to the show, and this is just one example of how it would be difficult to cancel or quit any service that has uneven terms that we don't like. But when it comes to regaining control of your online privacy, there are many simple steps you can take today that would make a difference on both your computer and your smartphone. I'll talk about those and more right after this. Welcome back. You've listened to this podcast and now you find that you're interested in taking major steps towards securing your online privacy, whether that's in a web browser on your computer or on your smartphone. Based on my research for the show, I want to offer a few practical next steps for how to control your data and achieve a better sense of privacy when using online services. Let's start with smartphones, since they are in fact where companies collect most of the data they have on individuals. One of the easiest things to do is to navigate to the main settings for the operating system, whether it's iOS or Android, and explore what privacy options you have. Both iOS and Android allow you to control which third-party apps have access to things like your camera, contacts, location, and microphone. This may take some time, but look through the list of apps and disable any of these permissions that you're uncomfortable with. Location services are always a good place to start. Most apps don't really need your precise location to operate normally. Additionally, when you're installing an app for the first time, Android and iOS both notify you about the permissions each app desires for operation. You are in control of these from the start. Don't be shy about disabling an app's access to your camera or microphone if it's a news app, a game, or some other app where these permissions don't seem necessary. It's also important to note that if you record audio and video inside an app like Instagram or Twitter, once you grant the app permissions to access your camera and microphone, it's perpetual. This means you'll have to go into the settings and revoke the permissions after each use, or Twitter and Instagram will have access to your microphone and camera all the time. Be aware when this happens and take a few extra moments to lock them out again. If we shift to using a desktop or laptop computer, one of the single best actions you can take to ensure your privacy online is the use of ad blocking software. These are generally extensions that may be added onto your desktop browser, which will remove advertisements from web pages and in some cases block the associated tracking scripts and cookies. A great example of this is the open source extension called uBlock Origin, which is now available for all major browsers. There are even entire browsers with built-in protections by default, such as ad blocking, cookie blocking, and other security features. A good example of this is the privacy-centered browser Brave, which also has built-in options for private browsing and completely anonymous browsing. As an aside, if you do most of your browsing from your smartphone, you'll find that you're unable to add extensions to Chrome or Safari like you can on the desktop versions. Instead, you could install the mobile version of Mozilla Firefox, which, at the time I'm recording this show, does allow the installation of extensions, specifically uBlock Origin, which means you can indeed block mobile ads while browsing the web from your phone. Another area in which you might desire the utmost privacy is in your messaging to others. More and more services are moving towards what's called end-to-end encryption as a standard for messaging, which means that only the device originally sending the message and the device that the message is sent to may read and interpret the message. This effectively eliminates the possibility that messages may be intercepted and read by third parties. However, it's still important to evaluate the privacy protections promised by these services. This is evidenced by WhatsApp, which does offer end-to-end encryption, but is also owned by Facebook, which, again, doesn't have the greatest track record when it comes to handling private data. One popular encrypted messaging app is Signal, which is available for both Android and iOS, and it offers things like encrypted messaging and disappearing messages. When we consider any type of browsing online, you also have to consider search engines. Google overwhelmingly dominates this space, accounting for around 75% of all online searches. But ever since 2008, web users have had the opportunity to use a privacy-centered search engine called DuckDuckGo. Searches on DuckDuckGo currently only account for 0.4% of all queries, but the service takes pride in not tracking its users. So much so that Madeline O'Leary considers DuckDuckGo's privacy policy to be one of her favorites.
DuckDuckGo is a very privacy-conscious, consumer-conscious search engine, and its privacy policy is super easy to read and not very long. So those are two very important things. And basically, it can be summed up like this, which is that DuckDuckGo doesn't collect or share personal information. And that's pretty much it. You know, they don't keep your IP address. Cookies are only used to save settings that you've configured. It has really solid HTTPS support. Searches are only saved in an aggregate way, so your searches you cannot be personally identified by your searches. It contains none of the corporate or legal doublespeak that is very common to these things, and it has a clear and accessible log of changes, and you can submit feedback.
I encourage you to read the policy yourself at duckduckgo.com/privacy. It's fairly short in comparison to other policies we've discussed, and the majority of it is an informative look at how search engine data are used and why you should care. For this reason, DuckDuckGo has a Class A rank on TOSDR, so if you're interested in keeping your web searches from following you around the internet, you might want to give DuckDuckGo a try. And if you're a Google Chrome or Firefox user, DuckDuckGo can now be set as your default search engine, making it easier than ever to use frequently. If in addition to your searches, you'd like your browsing history to remain private, many browsers offer modes that do not save any of your activity. This is often called private browsing or an incognito window. These may be opened by using keyboard shortcuts. For Chrome or other Chromium-based browsers, it's actually Control-Shift-N, or by clicking the Options menu in your browser, you'll see an option to open a private window. However, private browsing is only as good as your trust in your browser. If you truly want your activity to be masked, you might need to make use of other tools, one of which is called a virtual private network, or a VPN. VPNs mask your signature online, making it appear as if your computer is browsing from another location. Some services will recognize that you're using a VPN, but your location data, like your IP address, may be masked. It's not perfect, but it does offer a step of privacy above just using a private browsing window. Keep in mind that, like private browsing, VPNs are only as good as the trust you place in the company which provides the VPN service. Almost all VPNs come with terms and conditions as well as privacy policies that describe how they treat your activity while you're using the service. Be wary of VPNs that offer free services, as they may collect your data in exchange for the free service. There are many excellent paid VPNs that offer desktop and mobile access, so I'll leave it to you to do some research and find one that's best for you. And if private browsing behind a VPN isn't enough, there is the so-called nuclear option, which is to use a service called the Onion Router, or Tor. Tor is a browsing app that seeks to completely anonymize your online presence. And it's not perfect either, as the project's founders have had to deal with some vulnerabilities over the years, but as Ars Technica reported in 2016, the odds of being de-anonymized while using Tor are around 2 million to 1. It's available in more places than ever today, but it has also been the source of controversy due to its association with the dark web, or the darknet. For this reason, if you want to learn more about Tor, visit the project's website at torproject.org. Tor is probably overkill for the average user, so if we back up slightly, another fairly simple step you can take is to participate in security and data reviews within your most used apps. We've already mentioned Google's Privacy Checkup, which allows you to see a full record of what Google has collected and toggle on and off what types of data are collected. Simply navigate to myaccount.google.com while you're logged in, and you'll see a link to Privacy Checkup. In the same way, you can see similar information about what Facebook has collected on you at facebook.com/your_information. And there are many settings that you can change about tailored advertising from this settings console. But those are just two services. You'll need to go and check each service you use to see what options are available to you in relation to privacy controls. As more and more consumers become privacy conscious, alternatives to data collecting services will continue to spring up. But it's also important to realize that just because a service says it protects your privacy, it's still up to you to be aware of what you agree to when you sign up. This is why inspecting terms and conditions is still important regardless of the product or service. As an example, in my talk with Madeline O'Leary, while she did mention DuckDuckGo as having her favorite privacy policy, she just as readily offered an example of one that is, in her opinion, one of the worst.
I think the worst one that I've seen lately, and so I read it recently, and it's Snapchat. So just full disclosure, I don't use Snapchat, but the privacy policy and the terms are really, really something, because I guess, I guess you can make certain Snap stories viewable by everyone. And basically Snapchat can keep those for however long it wants, and it can use them forever for whatever it wants, perpetually. And also you're granting Snapchat, its affiliates, whoever that is, its business partners, whoever that is, an unrestricted worldwide right to use your name, likeness, and voice, even if they want to sell it. And that's it. It's like the Twilight Zone.
After hearing this, needless to say, I was intrigued, so I headed over to Snapchat's website looking for a privacy policy link, and I found instead a link to what they call their Privacy Center. After following the link, it's clear Snapchat has taken major steps to provide an easy-to-read and understand privacy statement. Most of the sentences in their privacy policy are closer to plain language than the typical legalese, and this is likely due to the GDPR, as we discussed in the last episode. However, in some cases, the language seems a bit too casual when discussing policies that may have a huge impact on the company's users. In the section titled Information You Provide, the policy states, quote, "Of course, you'll also provide us whatever information you send through our services, such as snaps and chats. Keep in mind that the users who view your snaps, chats, and any other content can always save that content or copy it outside the app. So, the same common sense that applies to the internet at large applies to Snapchat as well. Don't send messages or share content that you wouldn't want someone to save or share." End quote. I found the first sentence to be an extremely flippant way of saying that Snapchat is going to collect anything you send through the service. The "of course" at the beginning of the sentence was probably chosen because of the logical connection between you providing the data freely, so therefore they collect it. But in the context of this show, it sounds more like they just should have said, "Of course we're going to harvest all your data and use it for our interests. Did you think we wouldn't?" Anyhow, if you continue scrolling, you will indeed see that Snapchat collects usage data on every aspect of the app, similar to what we discussed back in episode 2 with tracking pixels and the like. And just like Madeline pointed out, Snapchat says it may share information with the general public, its affiliates, and its business partners. Now, I've veered away from our discussion on actions you can take to protect yourself, but I just couldn't resist going through the Snapchat policies as yet another example of how being aware of the agreements you've consented to is the most important step to securing your online privacy. Snapchat's policies on data retention and deletion even say, quote, "We hope you'll remain a lifelong Snapchatter," end quote. Because of course they do. The improvements in readability of Snapchat's policy admittedly helped me a great deal. I was able to quickly and easily find the sections I was interested in for reporting in this show, and I hope that other companies will do the same so that it's easy to see what protections you have and what data are being collected, even if it's all of them. I've covered a lot of information here, so let's do a quick recap. If you want to take steps to control your privacy, you may want to first check all of your current apps or websites for potential privacy settings that you can change. Start with Google and Facebook and keep going. If you want to lower the amount of data collected during browsing, consider either using private browsing or make use of a VPN or Tor to mask your online presence. Switch to DuckDuckGo or another search engine that doesn't save your searches, and install an ad blocking extension like uBlock Origin to block tracking scripts and other annoying ads. This is a lot to do by anyone's standards, but if anything, this show has shown that it's difficult to trust anyone but yourself when it comes to what data are being shared and how they are being used online. So, taking control of your online privacy is going to involve some work, and it's definitely not a one-time chore. Take Dr. Belanger, for example.
So I use private browsing on my computers, and it's extra effort on me. every single time you use private browsing. So for example, with Virginia Tech's two-factor authentication, 2FA, I have to use it every time, right? So I can't say, remember me for 7 days, because private browsing doesn't allow you to do that. And so I make the choice to use private browsing and to go through that extra effort all the time. There are so many like anonymous services online that you can use. And so my students in my security class, I have them use some of those as an experience.
And no matter what steps you take, services you use, or habits you instill, according to Dr. Belanger, your online privacy boils down to just one thing.
Again, is who do you trust? Do you trust the anonymizing company, or do you trust your platforms where you start from, or do you trust the network that Virginia Tech is using? Who do you trust? And so even when you use a virtual private network, when you think about it, so my virtual private network that I use for work, say I'm at the airport because I don't trust the airport's network, well, I'm trusting that Virginia Tech's not going to get hacked in their virtual private network. So at some point, you can use certain technology. So if I'm using Google Chrome and I'm using an incognito window, which is private browsing, well, I'm still trusting that Google respects the incognito window, right? So at some point, you do the best you can. You can decide not to share information that doesn't need to be shared. That's, I think, my biggest element. Just share at the minimum. Don't share everything. And so that's a choice that people make. So that's what I do. But as I said, I've been breached. And even though I'm very careful.
So if after that you're thinking, wait a minute, if someone who has researched data privacy in her career has been breached before, is there any hope for the rest of us? Well, as we draw this podcast to a close, I hope you've begun to reflect on questions like this. Who is actually in control of your personal data online? What exactly have you consented to in the hundreds of terms and conditions agreements and privacy policies that you've never bothered to read? What habits can you change to secure your online presence? I hope I've convinced you that while all of these questions have complicated answers, they are extremely necessary to think about in today's online climate. It remains to be seen how the digital privacy landscape will shift in the near future, especially as we await the outcome of California's privacy legislation. But one thing will always be for sure: privacy is a lifestyle, and in the end, it's up to you. My sincere hope is that you don't end up in the same position as Napster, the Los Angeles Rams, Mark Zuckerberg in a congressional hearing, or all of those people who signed away their firstborn children as part of an academic research study. So in the future, when you're signing up for a new service, installing an app or software, or even making a large financial commitment, I hope you'll take the time to make yourself aware of the details of the transaction. Because, of course, as you know, terms and conditions apply. And that's the show. It's been a fun and informative adventure for me, and I hope you've learned as much as I have. There are so many people to thank, and so I'll start with you, the listener. If you've made it this far, you've listened to the culmination of hours of research, interviews, voiceovers, and editing, and I can't thank you enough. I'm humbled that you chose to spend so much time with me, and you have my sincere gratitude. I also want to thank all of the people I interviewed for taking the time to talk to me, and of course for use of their comments to enhance this narrative. Those people are Ethan Zuckerman, Madeline O'Leary, Austin Chandler, Chris Katropia, Jim Gibson, Phyllis Weber, and Franz Belanger. A big shout out to my original test audience for providing feedback and encouragement to greenlight 4 more episodes after I shared a draft of the first episode with them. Specifically, that's Jeff Noble, Joseph Scoggins, Jody Bruchon, Dylan Leishow, Ezra Richards, Jake and Meredith Martinez, my parents, Dwayne and Cindy Smith, and finally, thanks to my wife Sarah for her encouragement and small laughs every time she would respond from across the house when I was playing back narration because she thought I was talking to her. I'm also incredibly grateful to two other very talented musicians and content creators, Lee Rosevere and Kevin MacLeod, for releasing their wonderful music under Creative Commons licenses so that I could redistribute it under this podcast. The show would not have been the same without its score, so if you're in need of music for a project, be sure to check out the links to more of their material in the show notes. Thanks also to Josh Lippy for answering my unsolicited message on Twitter about using his song for the outro. And, like me, if you're sad that the show is over, never fear. I plan on returning to this project eventually. Right now there are so many clips from my interviews that are worth sharing, and there were also so many other news items I didn't get a chance to cover during my time working on the show. Make sure you're subscribed if you don't want to miss any of the bonus episodes. And if you do need something to fill in your podcast void left by this show, I encourage you to listen to my other podcast, Life Experienced, in which I sit down with some of the most interesting people I've ever met to discuss their unique and interesting life experiences. You can listen to all 28 episodes right now at lifeexperience.org or wherever you get your podcasts. As always, Terms and Conditions Apply is written and produced by Ethan D. Smith. The narration for the show was recorded on a Shure Beta 87A microphone, thanks to Jesse Chan for the loan, edited in Audacity, and mastered with Isotope Ozone Elements 8. Thank you again so much for listening. You can find more information about the show as well as references and further reading on termsconditionsapply.com. I hope you'll share the show with others and let me know if you end up changing any of your online habits after you listen. You can contact me via the show's Twitter account at TermsCondPod or my personal Twitter at Ethan D. Smith. I'd love for you to share the show with your friends and leave a rating and review wherever you download the show. Until next time, I'm Ethan Smith, and this has been Terms and Conditions Apply.